Hello friend, welcome back to my channel KBS Necrocraft. Today we are going to understand what are the triggers and binding in Azure function. In this, we are going to understand in detail what are the different type of trigger and what are the different type of binding, what are the different kind of Azure resources are supporting what kind of binding and triggers. In this, we will also discuss what are the different types of triggers and what are the different kind of resources which are supporting these kind of triggers, and then we will discuss in more detail about the types of binding like in out input binding, output binding, and also we will try to find out or list out what are the resources which support input, which what are the resources which support input and output both. And then we will also discuss in more detail what are the different scenario where we use what kind of triggers or bindings. So let's begin with triggers. What is trigger? A trigger defines how a function is invoked, and a function must have exactly one trigger. Triggers have associated data, which is often provided as a payload of the function. So basically, whenever you have a event on which you want to perform a certain task, then you will basically call a Azure function with that particular type of trigger to perform certain tasks. We will discuss in more detail when we go further with example. So, what are binding? Binding to a function is a way of declaratively connecting another resource to a function. Bindings may be connected as an input binding, output binding, or both. For example, let's say consider you want a Azure function to be triggered whenever there is a message being pushed into the particular queue or add a message added in a particular queue. So what you do, basically you will create a Azure function with the Azure Service Bus queue binding. That binding will be input binding. Let's say consider another scenario. If you are having Azure function and you want to create Azure function which try to push a message into a particular queue, in that case we can use output binding. So there are many more, but at high level this is what binding called. Okay. Trigger types. These are the some example of trigger types. There are many more trigger type also available which works on different Azure resources. For example, here we have a HTTP trigger, then we have a timer trigger, queue trigger, blob trigger, event hub trigger, service bus trigger, Cosmos DB trigger, event grid trigger, and then we have a Azure storage table trigger. We have also some kind of Cosmos DB trigger, also SQL, and then Signaler. There are many more type of that. So, for example, if you want to uh, create a function which acts like a API, that means which can be triggered using HTTP REST API call. You can use it HTTP trigger. Time trigger is a trigger where you can trigger a function on a certain time interval. For example, if you want to trigger a Azure function for every 5 minutes, then you can use the time trigger. Queue trigger is when you want certain a certain operation being performed into the queue, and you want that Azure function to be triggered when a message being inserted into that particular queue. Then we can use queue trigger. Blob trigger is similar when you are having some operation performed in the blob and you want to trigger a function, then we can use blob trigger. Similar way, we have event hub trigger, service bus trigger, Cosmos DB trigger, event grid trigger, and Azure storage trigger as well. So we will discuss in upcoming videos for each different kind of triggers and what are the different kind of scenario when we can use this type of trigger in more detail. Let's consider binding type. As we discuss the bindings, there are three different type of binding which we can see: input binding, output binding, and there are some resources which support input and output both bindings. So majorly we use input and output bindings. So Let's consider the scenario when to use what kind of trigger and what kind of binding. So let's say consider you have a, a new message arrive in a message queue which runs a function to write in another queue. So what you do basically, so you have a trigger, that type of trigger is queue trigger, and then this binding we can consider as a output binding. Then let's say consider a schedule job reads blob storage content and create a new Azure Cosmos DB document. In that case, the input binding will be blob storage and output binding will be Azure Cosmos DB, and trigger will be time timer. For example, since we want to trigger it on a certain interval, which reads the data from blob storage and write into the Azure Cosmos DB. Let's consider another scenario. The event grid is used to read an image from blob storage storage and a document from the Azure Cosmos DB to send an email. So we will use event grid trigger, and then we will have a blob storage input binding and send grids as a output binding. Let's say consider you want to create a webhook that use Microsoft Graph to update an Excel sheet. In that case, we will use HTTP triggers, and then output binding for that will be Microsoft Graph. So output binding and input binding, I think you guys understand. The input binding is the what is the source of data which required to read by a Azure function, and output is something where to write, right? Where to write and where to update or where to insert this data, that is called a output bindings. Okay, so there are multiple resources in Azure which supports different kind of trigger and different kind of binding. So this list explains that what kind of Azure resources are supporting what kind of binding. The 1.x is here represents the .NET Core 1 version, and then 2.0 and higher version. So if you see in this, the first one is the type of resources, and then the second column is a .NET Core version, and third also the .NET Core version 2.x means higher than .NET Core 2. Then we have a trigger, then we have an input and then output. For example, if you try to refer here is blob storage. So blob storage supported uh, trigger, which also support input and output kind of bindings. And then we have a Cosmos DB. Again, you can refer it. Cosmos DB also support a inbuilt trigger, and then you will have a input and output binding. Azure Data Explorer does not support the trigger, but you can consider an input and output binding for that. Azure SQL it does not support in .NET 1.0, but is support in .NET 2.0 and higher. And you can see it supported input, output, and trigger. Similar way, we have a almost 20 resources which support different kind of triggers and input output. I will provide this detail in description. You can refer this. Now let's move on some example, hands-on example, real time, and we will see that how we can define a input output binding. Also, how we can define couple of different kind of triggers for our reference purpose. Okay, so let's get started on hands-on. So let's see. I'm just opening Visual Studio 2022. Okay, so today we are going to have two exercise. One, we are going to just understand how we can use the trigger. So I'm going to explain couple of example for triggers. So first I will go and create new function, and then I will give some name. Let's say I will give blob storage demo. Let's say consider like this. So I will use blob trigger for this, and for today's demo I am going to use a local storage, that means local simulator for storage, and that is basically get installed with the Visual Studio. So I will make other video for step what are the steps required to configure, but I just want to make sure that you understand that this is my local simulator which is there. This is basically Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer, which using that I am able to see the emulator blob storage and containers, right? So I'm able to see that. So we are going to use it. Let's see next, and I click on next. So I created this function, and then it will ask me few more details. So I just use now, let's say I'm going to use blob trigger. So I just click on blob trigger, and then here I will put connection string, right? And create. Okay. So once you create it, basically what will happen, since I have selected, if you see here is right local. So what will happen, it will basically connect to this, see, this emulator. This emulator is required when you want to do a hands-on on local machine. You do not want to use Azure resources, for example, or as a blob queues and other storage. So we can use it this. So if you want to connect to Azure storage, you can select this. I'm planning to use local Azure emulator, so I'm just using this, and I do not want to save anywhere, so that's fine. I will click finish. Okay, good. So my function is ready. Let me explain what basically does it do. So this blob trigger will be triggering whenever there is any file get uploaded to this particular blob storage, right? Blob container. So let's say where this blob container. So on my system, if I go here blob container, you can see the sample work items, right? Is there as a blob container which we are using sample work items. We are using it there. So I have that blob container, and then whenever a file get loaded, what does it do is read the file name, also the content, and then it will read the content and file name. It will display file name and then the content of that particular file. So that's what it's doing. This is just a simple POC kind of application, but in the real time scenario, you might need to read this file and do some operations and save it somewhere. So for time being, this is just to demonstrate how this blob trigger works and how we can use this blob trigger. Okay, so good. Let's see here. I will run it here, and then okay. Also, there is error, so I will go Solution Explorer, and there are some packages are there. What I will do, I will remove this wherever error is there. And let's see, build it. I'm building, those packages are not used anywhere, I hope so. So this is building as of now. Okay, build successful happen. Let me run it. Okay, so it's running now. Still it will take few minutes, few seconds, and then what I'm going to do, that I'm going to upload a file and see that how does it works. Okay, so connection string is missing. Let's do that. Connection string here, and connection string basically we need to add it here. So since I have given connection string name, I have to put here, and then I have to put connection string here. String, right? I'll save it. So I just want to verify the connection string name is correct. So whenever you are having some kind of communication with any storage, you need to define the connection string. For local connection string using Azure is the right emulator, we have to define this connection string. So it will allow us to connect it. So let me rerun. Okay, so it's running. It's read couple of files because there is already few files are there. So I will show you that there are a couple of files are. If you see here, there are a couple of files are there, right? So let me delete all these files, right? So I will delete these files. Okay, and I will rerun this application. So let's run it just to demonstrate because a lot of content was displaying on the console window. You might not able to see complete. So I deleted everything so that we will upload one file and see that file name and content are. So now nothing is displaying here. So what I will do, I will go and upload a file there, right? So go and upload file here, and then I will select a file. Let's say test demo, a file which where I'm uploading. So if you see here is a file is getting uploaded. So it's uploaded. You can see this function will, this function has to read that file. Okay, so you can see here this file get this read here. This is, if you see it was able to read that file. Now I will try to upload one more file. So new, and then upload it, and we will see on console. Okay, so you can see this file contains a lot of information, but you can see this here, right? It contains some information which we are using here, that contains a new for the file name which contains this some kind of code. So it's displaying here. So this is how the blob trigger works, and I hope it's make you to understand that how does it works. Okay, so now you see here what we are doing. We are reading content name and file content, whatever we are displaying it. Now for second example, I'm going to reopen Visual Studio and I'm going to create a new project. And this time we are going to use HTTP trigger function. So let's here, and then I'm going to give HTTP trigger function with in out both, right? So we can this now. I was just thinking to give a small name, but let's see that. Okay, so fine. We will create new, and then we will select isolated, and this time we will select that basically HTTP trigger, right? HTTP trigger, and then we will create this. Okay. Okay, so we have created, we will modify this code. Okay, so we have created this function here. Now I need to install a dependency here. So I will go and install that dependency. Let me copy that dependency, what exactly we are required to. So basically, since we have created this HTTP trigger function, is not having the storage, queue storage uh, NuGet packages, so I need to add it. So if I go here, it's not here, so I will add manage NuGet package, and then I will add that packages. So I will click on browse. I will storage. So basically extension dot storage, I need to install it. I will install it here. It will ask for me to multiple time for accepting. I accepted it, so it's installed. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy some code just to save the time. I will copy it, and then I will update the function, and then I will explain what I'm trying to achieve it. Right, so I'm just okay. Okay, good. So we are good by code as of now. So what I'm having it, this is the HTTP trigger, which is also using output binding. So what exactly it's doing? Basically, this function is HTTP trigger, which is getting the file name or some name value from the query string. As this HTTP trigger, it can receive any get and post request. So we are, whatever we are passing as a query string in the name value, what does it do? Basically, it's a create a message and save it. So if you see here, it's reading the request. In the request, we are having a query string as a name, and then it's reading that name value. And if it's not null, then it's creating, writing that message into the queue. So which queue? This is the queue which we are using it. And connection string is this. So since I'm using Azurite local connections emulator, so you can see here, this is my connection string. So where does it connects? If you open this, you will be able to see here there is a queue and there is an output queue which I have created already. It will be inserting the messages here. So time being is a 2 because I did it before our demo. I did it a sample where I tested it. It works fine. So I'm going to use it. So let me select these messages. I will dequeue it. Okay. Clear queue for time being. Yes. And then I will reopen that um, Azure storage. It's not required, but sometimes it does not uh, allow you to refresh the data, or it's allow to connect to the other applications. So that's why I did it. So let's say queue. Now if you go and queue, there is no message here, right? So let's get this started. We are going to run this. Okay, so I run this. Okay, so once it's run, we can open simple browser, and then we can pass a query string as a name. Whatever name value you are going to give it, this name value, if you see here, it's a basically it's a write hello name. This is the HTTP trigger successfully. This is a write message. Also same message basically it's going to write into the push a message into the output queue which we have, right? So let's see, it's still running. It once it's completed, it will give you a URL. So now just give me the URL. I will copy this URL, and then I will open a browser. As I've shown you, there is no uh, message there in that queue. So I will put query string name equal to I'll put, let's say, this is demo for input and output binding with HTTP trigger. I'm giving a big query string just okay, and then I will push enter. Okay, so it's successfully executed here. Now let's go there and we will try to see that messages here. Okay, so if you see here, this message whatever we passed it is inserted here, right? You can test it. Next, once again I will give name equal to, let's say, test2, right? So I given test2 and hello test2, this message display. If I go there and if I just refresh it, basically it will give you the test2 message are created. So just a understanding point of view, let's see here, we are having a output, so output queue, which is uh, output binding for this, and input is the HTTP trigger, which takes that HTTP type is trigger, and input type is input binding is that HTTP request, which is considering here, and is reading the query string value from there and putting data into the output queue. I hope it help you to understand what is input output and what is the HTTP trigger and blob trigger, what I have explained it. If you like what we see, please don't forget to subscribe my channel. Thank you so much.